It was the political scandal of the 1990s, reaching into the highest office of power in the free world and striking at the very heart of democracy. It brought the sleaze and corruption of government that we all know is happening in the shadows out into the light. What followed was a circus that P.T. Barnum would have been proud of, including hundreds of hours of media coverage, political infighting, threats of jail time, and more mudslinging than a mosh pit at Glastonbury after 3 days of rain. But how did one president's actions with one White House intern sully the legacy of a political dynasty forever? Why was it all such a big deal, and what did a stained dress have to do with the whole thing? Join us as we analyse the scandal only topped by Watergate and meet the woman whose name everybody knew in 1998. This is the Clinton-Lewinsky affair. So let's meet the cast of characters who are going to be important in this story, because there are so many. We have a lot of names to cover and they all contribute to this scandal in their own special way. Bachelor number one is Bill Clinton, 42nd President of the United States, jazz enjoyer, cigar smoker, and habitual womanizer. That's putting it kindly. Alongside him is his wife Hillary. You may know her from the 2016 presidential campaign and her many posts in government. Next is Monica Lewinsky, an intern in her early 20s who found her way onto Capitol Hill fresh-faced and with no idea about the mess she was about to get herself involved in. Following her and two more women who worked in politics at the time, they will be important for the legal wrangling around this whole case. Kathleen Wiley is a White House aide who Bill Clinton allegedly sexually assaulted in 1993. Meanwhile, Paula Jones was an American civil servant working in Arkansas back in 1991 when Clinton, the governor of the state at the time, allegedly flashed her in his hotel room whilst propositioning her for sex. She declined and would later sue Clinton over the incident for sexual harassment. Then there's Linda Tripp, another civil servant who would prove crucial to the scandal as a friend of Monica Lewinsky's. And finally, we have special independent counsel from the Justice Department, Ken Starr, who will be leading the legal charge in this story. There are plenty of other people involved in a small capacity here and there, but if we exhaustively listed them, we'd be here all day. So we'll introduce them as they arise. There are an awful lot of names in this story, but these are the most important ones to remember. So what does the timeline look like in the Lewinsky scandal? How does a young White House intern lead to a presidential impeachment, a national scandal, and shame brought upon a political dynasty that would never really go away? Well, it all began in June of 1995. Michael Jackson's Scream was high in the charts, Brad Pitt was named sexiest man alive, and ripped jeans were all the rage. But during this era, in a time of tiny sunglasses and frosted tips, a 21-year-old Monica Lewinsky arrived in Washington, D.C. whilst working for White House Chief of Staff Leon Panetta. And the best way to describe what happened next would be almost like in a movie. A stolen glance here and there, eye contact when the president would come to the Chief of Staff's office, and a building chemistry that by November of 1995 would explode into a hot and spicy affair. A month later, she moved into a paid position in the Office of Legislative Affairs, handling letters from members of Congress that would allow her to routinely make trips to the Oval Office. How convenient. But let's just say that whilst the affair was secret, it didn't appear like the pair were hiding it all that well. By April of 1996, around 5 months into the affair, then Deputy White House Chief of Staff Evelyn Lieberman transferred Lewinsky to a job in the Pentagon as an assistant. She told the New York Times later that the reason she moved Lewinsky to a new post was owing to inattention to work, as well as inappropriate and immature behaviour. At the Pentagon, Lewinsky could strike up a friendship with another career civil servant, Linda Tripp. And if that was the end of it, perhaps the affair would never have come to light and we'd never know all the details to come. But Lewinsky felt she had to tell someone about what was going on. She was banging the president after all, and it's hard to keep that to yourself, perhaps even for her own safety. So eventually Lewinsky started to reveal details to Tripp about her sexual encounters with President Clinton, confiding in her new friend. But this wasn't the first time Tripp had heard salacious stories coming out of the Oval Office. Back in 1993, Tripp had seen Kathleen Wiley come out of the president's office, quote, "disheveled, her face red, and her lipstick was off." And with the later allegations arising that Clinton had groped Wiley, Tripp apparently had told Lewinsky about this to tell her to try and be careful, but she also started secretly recording the conversations with Miss Lewinsky's relating to her relationship with the president. It's clear Tripp was concerned something similar could happen to Lewinsky. Also during this time, in mid-1997 or so, some media backrooms were starting to hear rumours about the president's sexual misconduct, whether in the case with Wiley or with Lewinsky. But it was kept pretty hush-hush, especially when compared to the media frenzy that would later surface. You see, Clinton was a womanizer, but that was personal, not illegal, and he had allegations going all the way back to his time as the governor of Arkansas, such as with American singer, model, actor and author Jennifer Flowers. So unless something really scandalous and concrete was afoot, it wasn't exactly front page news. Clinton being a sleazeball was the biggest open secret in Washington, but it wasn't the first, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. However, some people were privy to what the president was up to behind the scenes, not necessarily with women, but with other things too. And this is where we introduce Kenneth, or Ken, Starr, the independent counsel. Starr was actually first given license to investigate the Clintons in 1994 over the Whitewater real estate scandal. There are some dodgy dealings, financially involved projects that the Clintons had invested in back in Arkansas. We don't need to go into tons of details, but people went to jail, and at the time, Starr was trying to ascertain what the scope of the Clintons' involvement was in the whole thing to see if they were also criminally liable. His mandate, however, would be expanded several times over the years. First, he switched to additionally investigate the death of Vincent Foster, Deputy White House counsel under President Clinton, who died after ending his own life in 1993. Starr was brought in to assess if foul play was involved, because he already had a head start in investigating the Clintons. Foster was a large part of the Whitewater investigation too, so it all made sense. Starr would later pivot again to the Lewinsky case. And so, with a lot of controversy and potential conspiracies surrounding the president at the time, it was only going to take something concrete for everything to go nuclear. And in mid-1997 is when Starr catches wind of the Kathleen Wiley story, and at the same time, more bad news for Clinton would soon emerge. A lawsuit against him was picking up steam. This is where Paula Jones enters the fray. In fact, she'd been here the whole time, just in the background. After Clinton allegedly propositioned and flashed her in that Little Rock hotel room in 1993, Jones filed a lawsuit against Clinton in 1994 for sexual harassment. Now, these kinds of swirling rumours and even lawsuits around Clinton weren't all that surprising, nor noteworthy at the time, owing to his reputation, so it didn't really immediately cause public outcry. It was the 90s, a very different time to be a woman in politics. But as part of that lawsuit, in late 1997, a judge ruled that women that Clinton had encounters with could be compelled to testify under oath, and the president himself could be deposed whilst still in office. This was a bombshell that changed everything. The stories about the president went from backroom gossip and an acceptance of his infidelity as a personal pitfall that many knew about, to a potential sexual harassment case and real-life legal consequences. This was pretty novel for the time, the idea of the president himself being deposed in this manner, and so the media really latched on. And in late 1997, around a year and a half after Lewinsky went to the Pentagon, she was subpoenaed by Paula Jones' lawyers. When she told Clinton about this, he allegedly told her to be evasive in her answers to questions about their relationship. This would become much more of a problem later on, as Ken Starr's investigation would expand to investigate whether Clinton had compelled the other women in this case to lie under oath, which can be known as perjury or obstruction of justice. That's a big boy felony. And suddenly we go from minor concern to national scandal. Then in January of 1998, Lewinsky filed an affidavit in the Jones case, which is a written testimony made under oath, where she denied ever having a sexual relationship with Clinton. This was patently false and actually falls under the definition of perjury, which is illegal. Lewinsky and Clinton hoped that doing this would keep Lewinsky out of the lawsuit and stop Clinton from having to testify about her. People alleging your infidelity in the papers is one thing, having it legally verified in a court of law is another. All the while, Tripp had been secretly recording conversations with Lewinsky to prove that the statement she made was knowingly false, and she delivered those tapes to her lawyers, who later worked with Ken Starr's team. Similarly, at the time, Lewinsky actually gave Tripp a note outlining what to say about Lewinsky if authorities asked, hoping to downplay her involvement. She neglected to understand that Tripp likely didn't want to suppress the case, and she also didn't know that Tripp was secretly working with the authorities or recording their conversations. Ken Starr had even gotten the FBI involved at this stage, and a sting operation was launched in January of 1998. FBI agents would later approach Lewinsky and offered her immunity in exchange for her testimony. Lewinsky's own attorney, William Ginsburg, told her not to accept anything until he had learnt more. Lewinsky was in a difficult position, and the authorities knew she lied under oath, and the media had started to place her in the spotlight too. This was all getting very serious very fast. Even more so when the Attorney General was contacted and federal judges agreed to let Starr's investigation go even further to look into potential perjury and obstruction of justice, which meant digging the dirt on Clinton and Lewinsky's relationship. On January 17th, 1998, Clinton realized he had to try and get out in front of this whole thing, and in a televised White House address stated the famous line,
"I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people."
The phrase sexual relations would later be criticised for how specific it was. It would be like if you killed someone by kicking them to death and then stated confidently to the whole nation that their life did not end by my hand. It was, of course, total nonsense. The president lied to the country with his wife standing right behind him, and the media circus continued to swirl. Certain details had been leaked and the public knew about the scandal. Meanwhile, Clinton and his aides squarely denied that they told Lewinsky to lie about anything, even though he had heavily implied as such. In short, they threw her under the bus. Soon after, Ken Starr would establish a grand jury to hear evidence in relation to perjury, obstruction of justice, and any other charges connected to Clinton's relationship with Lewinsky and the Paula Jones lawsuit. It's important to remember that Jones's lawsuit was a separate legal event going on at the time, but there was a lot of overlap. From here, everything also falls into a political mud-slinging contest. Democrats and Republicans were hounding each other about what would happen next. Hillary Clinton even pushed the partisan line, calling the allegations against her husband a right-wing conspiracy theory. There was a significant concern that the tapes that Linda Trapp recorded of Lewinsky could be used in the Paula Jones lawsuit. Not that there was anything incriminating in them relating to that lawsuit, as far as we know, but because it would have been supremely embarrassing for both Lewinsky and Clinton. Now, the transcripts of those tapes were eventually released later, but at the time, a judge ruled in the Paula Jones case that Lewinsky's evidence was not essential to the core issues of the case and was therefore inadmissible. After all, a consenting sexual encounter between two adults wasn't what Jones was accusing Clinton of. But Lewinsky had bigger problems. She still had no immunity, meaning that if she was found to have committed perjury or obstruction of justice, then a grand jury could indict her and send her to jail, and the media was swirling around her. Dozens of people were called to testify at the grand jury. Some were people like Lewinsky's parents and her mother, Marcia Lewis, in particular, who was forced to answer so many questions she became physically and emotionally exhausted, unable to continue after several days. Others, like Kathleen Wiley, were also made to testify, as well as various White House staffers and people who knew the president. But with every step closer that the grand jury took towards the commander-in-chief, a legal argument started. For starters, Clinton's lawyers claimed he had an executive privilege, meaning that certain communications couldn't be brought before the judiciary because of things like national security. It's a pretty standard concept with the separation of powers. Certain aides being forced to testify would cause Clinton not to be able to get candid and important advice on political matters. In short, it would stop him doing his job properly and undermine the executive branch's function. But Clinton would eventually lose this battle when federal judge Norma Holloway Johnson ruled that the president can't use executive privilege to block testimony in a potential criminal investigation. Even some Secret Service members would be forced to testify after a legal back and forth that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. But Clinton did have a win though. when federal judge Susan Weber Wright dismissed the Paula Jones lawsuit. This was because even if the allegations were assumed to be true, the court found they didn't rise to the legal standard of sexual harassment under the law as it was at the time. If it happened today, it may well have had a different outcome. But Clinton continued to claim on all fronts that nothing improper happened. Meanwhile, the White House even attacked Wiley, accusing her of trying to sell the story about Clinton for several $100,000, which her lawyers vehemently denied. But despite this legal victory, it was getting harder and harder for Clinton to bat off the allegations of perjury, even if the ones around sexual harassment were dealt with for now. Retired Secret Service agent officer Louis Fox testified before the grand jury that during a visit by Lewinsky to the White House in the fall of 1995, Clinton told him, quote, "Close the door, she'll be in here for a while." Now, again, the sex doesn't actually matter here. It's the lying about it and the obstruction of justice afterwards by both Lewinsky and Clinton that matters. And evidence like this denotes a sexual relationship was going on, which both Clinton and Lewinsky had already denied under oath. No relationship, no perjury. But a relationship shows that there was something to lie about, and doing so under oath is a big no-no in US law. You could tell the whole thing was getting to Clinton. When asked in a press conference at the time if he thought the American public should care about what presidents do in their private lives, he stated, quote, "I think that I'm in some ways the last person who needs to be having a national conversation about this." The next person up on the grand jury was Linda Tripp, who in a way was a key catalyst in this whole thing. She was able to give her side of things, claiming that she never deceived or tricked Lewinsky when she taped their conversations about her affair with the president. This in and of itself would spark a legal question about whether Tripp broke a Maryland state law requiring both parties to consent to a taped conversation. As far as we could find though, she was never found guilty of anything. By late July, Bill Clinton himself was finally subpoenaed to appear before the grand jury and answer questions by Ken Starr, just like anybody else, causing a whole slew of negotiations over the scope of such questioning and the timings. And at a similar time, negotiations began with Monica Lewinsky and Starr's team to grant her immunity from prosecution in exchange for her testimony. If they could get Lewinsky to testify that the relationship happened and provide proof, then the potential implications for the president could be very dire, including impeachment. They didn't want to put Lewinsky in jail, she was just the hook. Clinton was the big fish they were trying to catch. Eventually, an immunity deal was reached. Nothing would happen to Lewinsky or her parents. Lewinsky admitted to having a sexual relationship, but was adamant that Clinton never asked her to lie about it, although it would later be revealed that Clinton had put certain rules in place for their affair. And whilst there was no explicit instruction saying lie under oath to protect me, Lewinsky felt it was implied by him, and other important factors like their natural power imbalance and the emotional attachment also likely influenced her decision. And this is where we have to talk about the dress. As part of this deal, she also had to hand over a dress that she alleged contained what we'll call physical DNA evidence that would prove beyond a shadow of doubt that the sexual relationship between her and President Clinton existed. The garment was handed over to the FBI for lab testing. Clinton eventually relented and made the choice to voluntarily testify in front of the grand jury, so his subpoena would be withdrawn. Always best to walk into this kind of thing willingly rather than being dragged kicking and screaming after all. In fact, by 1999, both Clinton and Lewinsky would testify in front of the grand jury, not together, although that would have been pretty amusing at the time. After Clinton's questioning was finished, he went on national TV to admit he had established an inappropriate relationship with Monica Lewinsky, quoting here, "Indeed, I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong. It constituted a critical lapse in judgment and a personal failure on my part for which I am solely and completely responsible. But I told the grand jury today, and I say to you now, that at no time did I ask anyone to lie, to hide, or destroy evidence, or to take any other unlawful action." Apparently, and unsurprisingly, his wife and daughter did not take it well when they heard the news that the president was going to make this apology, admitting to the whole thing. One White House aide said that it was wrenching for them both. Incredibly, his approval ratings actually increased after this announcement. Much of the testimony of both Lewinsky and Bill Clinton would eventually be publicly released, as would various photos, including the one of Lewinsky's DNA-covered dress. The FBI's lab found that it did match the president's own DNA, confirming the affair in a watertight case. All in all, the final report from Ken Starr and the grand jury would find 11 separate potentially impeachable offences within the president's words and actions, and it was a low point of shame for Clinton, and it would tarnish his legacy in public office for many years after the fact. A 12-day vacation in Martha's Vineyard followed so that the Clinton family could start trying to put itself back together again. I bet breakfast was awkward. But for Clinton, it wasn't over, because in late September of 1998, the House Judiciary Committee announced that it would consider a resolution to begin bringing an impeachment inquiry against the president, an inquiry which would eventually be seen through. When you look at the legacy of the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, only one thing really becomes apparent. Everybody lost. Running through the major players of the scandal, you can see how absolutely nobody, not even society itself, came out unscathed. For President Bill Clinton himself, his approval ratings might have been up at the time, but his reputation was irreparably damaged by the affair. For one, he was one of the only presidents of the United States to be successfully impeached. 4 articles were eventually brought against him. 2 referred to perjury. 1 was for lies he told when interviewed by the House Judiciary Committee, and the last was for obstruction of justice. He lied to a grand jury, something that would put most people in prison, and he was very fortunate at the time to be the most powerful man in the world. After being successfully impeached on 2 of those accounts, he stated that he would not resign like President Nixon before him when he was impeached by the Watergate scandal. He also denied lying under oath, even though he was found to on several different occasions. It's hard to know whether he really believed that, but he probably didn't. In an impeachment, there often follows an actual trial of the president, where the 100 senators act as the jury and vote on whether the president should be convicted. This is usually done along party lines, but luckily for Bill, the senators acquitted him 55 votes to 45. So the whole thing for Clinton seemed more like a stern telling off from the other branches of the government rather than any real punishment. He did up settling with Paula Jones' sexual harassment case out of court, even after it was dropped, paying $850,000, and in exchange he didn't have to admit a thing. Only those 2 really know what happened between them in that hotel room, and she has since retreated from public life altogether. Meanwhile, the last anyone heard of Wiley was a report of her working as a freelance writer in Powhatan County, Virginia. The whole Lewinsky affair overshadowed his second term and much of his legacy as a president too. When people think of Bill Clinton today, it's often the first thing that people bring up, even a generation after the fact. It even negatively affected things for Hillary Clinton. For starters, her own husband had an affair with a younger woman and deceived her about it. It's got a sting, and what's more is that she received a lot of criticism at the time for standing by him. Some called her resilient and faithful, others said she was enabling the president's dangerous behaviour. She was a politician as much as anybody else on Capitol Hill, and she knew how to play the game and how bad it might look for her own career. She was put in a difficult position, but decrying her own husband's affair as a right-wing conspiracy theory left her with egg on her face that still resonates in political circles today, even though she was a victim in all this. Hillary Clinton's own presidential campaigns have been marred by what her husband did, in particular her campaign in 2016 against now 2-time President Donald Trump, where during a debate Trump asked the nation, if Hillary Clinton can't satisfy her husband, what makes her think she can satisfy America? Trump made several other references to Bill throughout the campaign, and whilst we'll never know if his comments truly made a difference, it was likely just one more piece of the puzzle that turned the public away from the established and sleaze-dripping Clinton name towards Trump and his new direction for America. Linda Tripp didn't emerge unscathed from the whole thing either. She was vilified in the public eye for allegedly deceiving Lewinsky when she recorded their conversations, even though many others argue that she did do the right thing. Tripp herself always felt justified in her actions, claiming that she was concerned not about the affair, 2 consenting adults can do whatever they wish, but about the potentially predatory behaviour of the president at the time. Clinton had the Paula Jones lawsuit on his hands already, and Lewinsky was 3 decades his junior. That was going to ring alarm bells for some people. Tripp would eventually pass away in 2020. Meanwhile, key prosecuting attorney Ken Starr also got his fair share of criticism. Whilst at the time people were pleased to see someone going after politicians for potential misconduct, many have since seen his dedication to the Lewinsky scandal as a symptom of massive judicial overreach. After all, Starr was originally brought in to investigate the president over the Whitewater real estate scandal, but he quickly pivoted to the Lewinsky affair when he caught wind of it. Starr's relentless going after 2 adults for having an intimate but legal relationship also blurred the lines for everyday citizens between private morality and public accountability. It left a lot of people saying why and so what. Starr's reputation would also take a tumble in the ensuing years as he took on cases to defend individuals like Jeffrey Epstein. Why did morality matter with Lewinsky, but not with Epstein? He would pass away in 2022 with a complicated legacy, but one of public service nonetheless. Then there's the centre of the whole story, Monica Lewinsky herself. For starters, her career was tarnished forever. Whilst it ultimately takes two to tango, and both the president and Lewinsky knew what they were doing was wrong, she was arguably the biggest victim in all of this, other than Wiley and Jones. She was an intern in her early 20s, being courted and groomed by the most powerful man on the planet at the time, who was 3 decades older than her. One of those two people had their future wrecked and their life dragged through the mud before their very eyes, and the other's approval ratings spiked. Guess which one was which. Lewinsky was mocked and vilified by the press, reduced to a national punchline for decades after the fact. Her own self-image and self-worth were utterly destroyed in the wake of the scandal. During the whole thing, her first lawyer sent her to a Vanity Fair photographer to help her feel better about herself, but this just led to more ridicule from the public and media. Lewinsky struggled to reclaim her identity for years after the scandal, and even moved abroad for a time to get away from her name being associated with DC sleaze. Nobody is saying she did nothing wrong, she was part of the affair, but all she did was bang the president, and that's not a crime. It's certainly not worth having your life ruined for it. But mercifully for Lewinsky, this perception is now more common than it used to be, and she is one of the few people who today is looked on more favourably than they were at the time. She's returned in part to public life and has had a few interviews here and there. Her Twitter is actually pretty funny, and she can even poke a little fun at herself over it all, now enough time's passed. She's also become an anti-bullying advocate in the years since, raging against false narratives and incorrect public perceptions over both her story and others. Even the media itself couldn't escape sharp critique from the public in the aftermath of the whole thing. The massive media frenzy over the scandal was in no way proportionate to what was actually going on at the time. Sure, it helped spark a debate about the nature of the Oval Office and privacy for public figures and the general sickly veneer that seems to follow politics everywhere it goes, but the media also had its part to play in whipping up the public into a circus. Between January the 22nd of 1998 and February 12th, 1999, a little over a year at the height of its story, 2,345 minutes of the evening newscasts were devoted to the scandal. For reference, that's almost 4 times longer than the entire Lord of the Rings extended trilogy, and a much better viewing too. There are fewer orcs in the capital at least. This scandal, in effect, was part of what gave rise to the 24-hour news cycle that latched on to US politics and has since poisoned the entire world. It also manifested a public cynicism over the media's portrayal of events, as well as over the blatant partisan nightmare in how it was covered. These concepts are now par for the course. It may have always ended up this way, but this certainly didn't help. And you could argue that even society as a whole took a hit too, as relates to women's roles when it comes to US politics. But more than that, it asks the question in Western society of who should be blamed when powerful men do shady stuff, thinking that their status can help them get away from it, especially in relation to sexual assault and misogyny. That invincible culture has since taken something of a dent. The Me Too movement helped to expose some of it in Hollywood years later and has gradually started to bring public opinion round on Lewinsky, but politics, and even society still, as a whole, has a long way to go. So in a way, the Lewinsky scandal was more than just a scandal. It was a realigning event, just no one knew it at the time. Nothing would ever be the same afterwards, not on Capitol Hill, not in the media, not even in our own perceptions of politics or the Clinton family. It was the event that blew up the already rotten corpse of politics, and the rest of us were left with nothing but a bad smell and a stained dress. Thanks for watching.